over the time you've been doing this, what has been, I'm going to do both sides. What has been the easiest device you've come across? And then what has been the hardest device you've come across?
Okay. Easiest
Obviously, like,
device.
easiest kind of difficult because, you've gotten methods now. Like, so it's a lot
Hmm.
easier to do devices than it would have been in like the early days. But yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So I would say the easiest device, well, the hardest device, I mean, you're right on that, is going to be the very first thing we reverse engineered because we had
Mhm.
no idea what we were doing.
Right.
Um, but if I had to go for a hard device these days, knowing how to reverse engineer stuff,
Mhm.
it would basically be, I would probably say anything that had a protocol that uses some kind of CRC or checksum
Mhm.
or other like integrity message,
Oh, okay.
because decoding, like you can look for R, G, and B in a packet stream pretty
Mhm.
easily, and you can look for the modes changing when you change the modes or the speeds or the brightness or anything like that.
Mhm.
But when you see some values that just kind of randomly change every time the message updates and you don't know why,
Mhm.
um, your guess is that's going to be some kind of CRC, checksum, some kind of integrity code. But how is that calculated? That's
Right.
the hard part. Like you have to look at that and go, okay, which format is this calculated on? Luckily, there are some online calculators where you can just paste in a string of bytes and it'll give you like all the different types of like 20 or 30
Hmm.
different types of integrity checks, like CRC 16, 32. There's a bunch of different algorithms, like hashing algorithms, that you could
Mhm.
use to produce some kind of integrity code. A lot of them are really easy. You just like add all of the bytes together and take, you know, the remainder of that or something like that. But
Mhm.
sometimes they're not as easy. And that was something I ran into with this particular keyboard, is it had a very strange CRC, and I
Mhm.
I still don't even know if I'm actually doing it right, but it's working. So
Hasn't
um,
bricked yet.
yeah, it hasn't bricked, and it's actually takes the update. So either they ignore the CRC or I'm calculating it correctly. But we've run into some of those before where you have to calculate some kind of verification code based on the packet
Mhm.
before you send it.
I can
Um,
see why you would have like a simple verification, but why you do anything more complex than that? I don't
yeah,
know what the engineers would be thinking when they were designing that.
yeah. So that's just something I can think of running into that kind of makes you think a little bit like, what is this actually doing?
Mhm.
But then, easiest thing to reverse engineer by far would have to be anything that has documentation.
Right,
And
right,
that
right.
leads us into the next topic. But even if it's not like official documentation, this is where like going back and using OpenRazor or
Mhm.
CKB Next,
Yep,
or
yep.
there were like G801 LED for Logitech keyboards. There were a bunch of open source projects, and Liquid CTL is another one.
Mhm, mhm,
Going through and gleaning information from these other projects, because they've already done the reverse engineering, and a lot
mhm,
of them like had GitHub wikis and such that
mhm,
they
mhm.
actually documented out their protocols.
Oh
And
wow.
that's something I was doing, at least for OpenRGB, especially in the early days, was I was maintaining the GitHub or GitLab wiki with all the protocol documentation. Like I was writing my own documentation. I haven't been as good about that more recently, but in the early days, that was a big help to
Mhm,
kind of learn how to do things. And having that documentation from people who had already done it was a huge help.
mhm.
So yeah, I would say that the easiest would be by far anything with documentation.
Mm.
So
Oh, that feels like a cop out answer to me, but sure, we'll go with it.
well, okay, if I had to pick one, unfortunately, so I will give you one that the company actually reached out and contacted me. This was actually fairly early on,
Mhm,
and it was HyperX,
mhm,
before they got bought out by HP or split up. It was their RAM division. I had posted on Reddit that I was making OpenRGB. I think I posted it on the HyperX subreddit.
mhm,
And they reached out to me and said, "Oh, we find this very interesting. We'd like to send you a kit of Fury DDR4 RAM." And they also sent me the protocol documentation for it.
mhm,
Now, the problem is I had already reverse engineered it and had it mostly working.
mhm,
But being able to look through their actual official documentation and confirm that I was doing the right thing,
Right.
and then fill in the gaps where I was unsure.
Mm-hmm.
That made it way easier, and so that RAM became one of the most supported RAM that
Mm-hmm.
is in OpenRGB.
Mm-hmm.
So I that is probably the example of like well supported because of documentation, even though
Right.
they were kind of delayed. The only other ones would be some of the like smart lighting stuff, like Philips
Okay.
Hue and I think LIFX,
Mm-hmm.
because those companies actually have like developer documentation on their websites.
Yeah, it's almost like they
Because
want you to
those,
control the lights.
yeah, like the lights, the smart lighting people tend to be a little bit more open about that because they want the third party apps to integrate with their devices. But the RGB PC stuff generally, they
Mm-hmm.
have not been that open. So